And then for this story, the two disciples of anarchy really come down to Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman, which this is where anarchy just kind of falls apart for me, right? Because it's like they were kind of the leaders of the philosophy that said no leaders. So they weren't in charge of anything, but if anything happened, everyone's going to run to them and say, well, did you do it? Do you support this? Can you talk about these two? I mean, especially approaching it from, I've seen them written up in other places. And generally what I find is everybody goes too far one way or the other, like you were talking about before, which is they're scum, forget this, or that they were misunderstood and they were forced into these situations. And I feel like you do a very good job of making them sympathetic without saying, like, it's okay to blow people up.
Yeah, it was a very delicate line to walk with them. One of the things that was so exciting for me as an author with this book, which really differs from any of the other books I've ever written, is there's an enormous amount of actual dialogue in the book, particularly between Berkman and Goldman, because, in large part because Goldman wrote a wonderful autobiography, a voluminous autobiography, but also because there's so much reporting. They're like incredible, like the number of like articles that I relied on to write this book is just, so there's a lot of actual dialogue that comes from the news reporting, contemporaneous news reporting at the time. This book has like far more kind of intimate scenes where two characters are talking to each other, where I did not invent a single word of dialogue. It's all from, the original sources. It gets you into this relationship, this lifelong relationship between these two emigres from Russia, who arrive in New York City still as teenagers, like 19-year-olds, 18-year-olds, swept up in this kind of Lower East Side anarchist movement, and they end up staying together in one form or another for really the rest of their lives. And I won't give away too much of the ending in the book, but they end up getting deported together. They're briefly, for a stretch of time, lovers, and then they live together platonically for a large number of their kind of subsequent years. So it's a fascinating relationship. And to your question about their values, it's very much fraught with this question of like the efficacy of political violence. And Berkman, who I think, be interested to hear what you say, I think he comes across as the less sympathetic of the two, pretty much remains convinced that political violence is necessary. And the argument is the capitalists are already committing all this political violence. The government is already committing all this political violence. Far more people are dying in factory fires and explosions than anybody is dying from terrorist acts. So they started it, basically. Famously, there's a whole set piece in the book about Berkman as a very young man, shortly after coming to the United States, attempts to kill Frick, who is the deputy to Andrew Carnegie, and he ends up going to jail for a long time. So there's kind of violence at the beginning of their relationship. And then later in their career, basically, Goldman professes to drift away from that worldview, and it comes to think that the violence is ultimately not worth it. But at some crucial points, she seems to be not quite capable of renouncing it. And so it's a very complicated story about what her real attitude was, whereas Berkman's remained pretty staunchly and convinced that there was a use for terrorism in radical politics.